We have got some really interesting speakers with us today. We have Maiden from Green Small Business, who is a local organisation who run environmental training schemes. They also run a green certification scheme, if I can say that, and put my teeth back in, for small businesses. And they also offer lots of different services in terms of help with environmental policies and basically guiding businesses through their journey to net zero. We also have Ellie Marshall from EcoGo Zero, who are a rather amazing organisation who do all sorts of really innovative things in the world of sustainability and net zero. But key to here, they're an organisation who offer a wealth of innovative solutions across all areas to try and help businesses reach net zero. And key to that is they do offer quite a lot of training, and they also have some brilliant IT solutions as well. So Tim is going to talk us through environmental policies and sort of frameworks in terms of producing your own environmental policy, and Ellie is going to touch on carbon accounting, which is quite a big subject in its own right, really. So in terms of housekeeping, we already had a little bit of that there that flashed up on the screen. The meeting is being recorded so that we can use it and publicise it elsewhere, and hopefully it will be a valuable learning resource for other people as well. If you don't want to be recorded, please turn your cameras off. However, we are running some little breakout sessions partway through, so it'd be appreciated if within the breakout sessions you could turn your cameras back on. And if you could also just put your name on your profile within Zoom, that would be really useful, just so we know who's in the different groups and who we're talking to. So I think that's everything in terms of all the housekeeping. We will be having question and answer sessions as well. So if anybody, if you just want to put your questions in the chat function, and at the end of everybody's presentation, you'll have a short time for questions and answers, but we'll also take any additional questions and answers at the end as well. So what is an environmental policy, and why do I need one? An environmental policy outlines your organisation's commitments to reduce its impact on the environment and provides a framework for setting objectives and targets to implement better environmental performance. It's quite a long-winded definition, but basically it's a statement that says you're planning to do what you're planning to do as an organisation to better manage your environmental impact. That's something that you can't do in isolation. It's not just a statement that stands on its own. In order to manage your environmental impact, you need to first of all understand what your impact is. You need to be able to monitor and report on this to make sure you're actually making progress, and there's that feedback loop there to show that you are actually achieving any of these set targets. You also have to have the help of your entire organisation in order to do this. For a lot of you, that will just be yourself. That will just be yourself and one other potentially. But for larger organisations, it is a document that really needs to come from the ground up, because everybody is involved in actually helping meet the environmental targets of a business. It's not something you can do in isolation. So it's not really a statement in its own right that you can produce and stick on a website without showing anybody or making aware of. It does have to be kind of a living, moving document for it to actually add value to the business. And why do you need one? There's a number of factors. Visitors are starting to ask for this, and it's starting to become a key influencing factor in their decision making. Whilst it's not the only thing they will base their decision on, if visitors are looking for one key characteristic to stand out above one accommodation provider, attraction provider versus somebody else, this is one of the things that can tip that balance. They do want to know about your environmental credentials, and awareness of this amongst our audience is growing massively. You only need to look at people like booking.com, who are starting to provide sustainability ratings on their own website. There's a lot of other organisations looking at following suit as well, because the prevalence of this within visitors is just growing massively. Larger and international tour operators are also starting to ask for it. And whilst they're on their own journeys to net zero, they're realising that actually they need to have that influence amongst their supply chain to get there. And in order to do that, they need to work with businesses that have a similar ethos to themselves, and they need to make sure that as part of their procurement processes, they're working with organisations that also have some sort of framework set out to show that they're trying to minimise their environmental impact. So it is starting to become one of those prerequisites for doing business. The bottom reason, and probably the most important reason, we are at a point where we are climate crises, a lot of people want to call it. However you view it, there is definitely a need for us all to start reducing our environmental impact and reaching net zero. And it's an environmental policy is a really good way to show that you are actually on that journey and to put that information out there and let people know. It's a great thing to be doing. A lot of organisations are doing it anyway, but actually shouting about it, be proud of it. It's something that you are doing. It's a really positive step. Both visitors and your supply chain, you know, everybody will appreciate that. It's also a really good thing for your corporate brand in terms of attracting and retaining staff as well, because a lot of the younger generations do actually have a desire to work for companies whose ethos is similar to their own. So it can be a really good way of attracting and retraining staff as well. So to know where you're going to minimise your impacts, you need to know what your impacts are in the first place. So here is just a really quick summary of tourism and net zero. I know a lot of you on this webinar are probably already aware of this and have seen a lot of these facts and figures, but it's just a bit of a whistle-stop tour just to kind of give a bit of background and a bit of context really. According to Cumbria's Carbon Baseline Report 2019, you can see that visitors have quite a significant impact on the carbon baseline for the county. 51% of the carbon within Cumbria is attributed to residents. The other 49% is attributed to visitors. A significant proportion of that is down to travel. So as you can see, visitor travel to the county accounts for 36% of the carbon footprint. If you break that down a little bit further, you can see that actually travel is fairly major, but other areas that you've potentially got a little bit more control over are things like leisure, recreation and attractions, but another significant one is food and drink, and the supply chain in terms of food and drink as well. So tourism and net zero, well, I'm going to touch here a little bit on emissions and scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. A lot of you may already be aware of these, but this is just a bit of an overview for those of you who aren't. The emissions are basically broken down into 3 different categories: scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. On a very, very basic scale, scope 1 and scope 2 are emissions that are owned or controlled by a company. Scope 3 are much more indirect emissions that are more outside of a company's sphere of control, but not necessarily a sphere of influence. So scope 1 and scope 2 emissions tend to be things like electricity, so the carbon offset from the electricity that you're using within the building. Scope 2 would be the carbon from the production of that electricity in the first place, which you do have a direct impact upon because you can reduce your electricity usage. A scope 3 emission is something like if a visitor decided to come and drive from wherever to your attraction, your B&B, your restaurant, you couldn't necessarily control the amount of fuel that they're using, what vehicle they're driving in, you know, what the engine, if that was a 3 litre, whatever. But these are still things that you can actually influence. So your environmental policy, you really need to kind of think about where you can have that biggest influence, and it's sometimes useful to kind of break that down into scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions. It's quite often easier to focus on scope 1 and scope 2 because again those are things that are more directly, you're directly in control of, and whereas scope 3 emissions are much more based within your supply chain, so they're a lot harder to influence. But if you just have a quick look at this next slide, so this is a breakdown from the Zero Carbon Forum, which are quite a useful resource if you want to go and have a look at their website. They specifically work around tourism and hospitality, but they just give a really good idea in terms of the scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions of different business types in terms of pubs, restaurants and hotels. But again, you can kind of see within this that within the tourism industry, scope 1 and scope 2 contributions are actually fairly low. It's scope 3 contributions that have a significant impact, and that kind of reflects back to the Cumbria-wide statistics as well. It's that visitor travel, which is probably classed more, to a certain extent, some of that could be scope 1, scope 2, but more sort of the scope 3. It's the food and drink supply chain, which again, a lot of the impact of that is scope 3, because scope 3 emissions would be things like the resources and the carbon produced from producing in the agricultural processes for the producing food that you're using within your cafe or restaurant. So again, those are the things where tourism and hospitality do tend to have that bigger impact without realising it. So in terms of when you're thinking about how you can have an impact, you do need to think about your emissions. And while it's really important to focus on those scope 1 and 2 and the things you have that direct impact over, you do need to factor in those wider emissions as well, and start thinking about longer term planning and where you could help to reduce those. So after scaring everybody with all the different types of emissions and all the bit of information overload, where do you start? Well, writing an environmental policy, it isn't simple, really. Well, it is to a certain extent, but it isn't just as basic as sort of filling out a template and sort of writing something out there and getting something in the public domain. There is a process that you do have to go through to kind of make sure that this document is something that's embedded within your business. And if it's embedded within your business, it's something that then becomes easier to use, easier to manage, and it does become a working document. And that is where it can add a lot more value to your business. And there are a lot of resources out there at the moment. There are great organisations in counties such as Tim's. There's quite a lot of funding out there as well at the moment that you can tap into, which again, at the moment, the government are very much carrot and not stick in terms of trying to encourage businesses to do this. But at some point there will be, you know, they're talking about potentially putting a cost to carbon and potential carbon taxes in the future. So really now is the time to be looking at how you can reduce your carbon footprint. And there is that funding out there to enable you to do that. So it is a good time to be taking advantage of that. So again, it might be something that seems daunting, but it is something that, you know, once you understand the process and you've got some tools and things to help guide you through it, it is something that is relatively simple to do. It's just making sure that it is something that's embedded kind of as part of your business practices, really. I'm going to pass over to Tim now, who will give you a bit more of a sort of talk through in terms of the structures and the process that you can go through within your organisation. And I will probably take any further questions at the end, but we'll stop and have a little question and answer session at the end of Tim's session as well.
Thanks, Gemma. Morning, everyone. So I need to share my screen, Gemma, which I think means you stopping sharing yours, does it? Oh, I can stop you. Right, there we go. Excellent. Okay. Can you see that now, Gemma? Is that working all right? Great, excellent. Okay, so, I mean, I guess as Gemma said, one way that you can approach the development of an environmental policy or environmental management system for your business is to go into Google environmental policy, download a template from somewhere, put your logo on the top, and job done. Or you could perhaps look at one of your competitor websites, do a copy and paste, and there we are. We're all sorted. I guess what I want to get at in the next sort of 15 minutes is at a high level, what are the considerations that you need to have in terms of developing an approach to managing your environmental impacts as a business that has real integrity and that will withstand scrutiny from consumers and from other customers that you might have. So in terms of content, there we go. I'll introduce myself briefly, and then I want to make three high-level points about how you should be approaching this whole area. Firstly, the importance of being comprehensive in the consideration of your impacts as a business. Secondly, the importance of focusing on the important stuff. And then thirdly, setting yourself up for delivery, for actually taking action on your environmental impacts rather than just having a policy. So, oh, and finally, I'll summarize some of the support and the funding that's available at the moment in this area for you to access. So just briefly on Green Small Business, the company that I run. We provide environmental action planning and certification for businesses of all sizes. Actually, in spite of the name, we do work with businesses of all types and sizes, and we also help with carbon footprinting, which Ellie is going to talk about towards the end, and helping businesses to think through how they can work towards what we call net zero, where you've reduced your carbon emissions sufficiently that you've just got a little bit that you can offset in order to achieve net zero some way down the line. So working with businesses on all of that good stuff. And we've worked with lots of businesses locally. A few of the logos of those businesses are up on the screen there. Some of them you might recognize. And also, you know, working nationally and a little bit internationally as well now, which is exciting. So I guess the mere fact that greenwashing is in the Oxford English Dictionary now tells you all that you need to know about the dangers here. Companies are being called out on an almost daily basis for making misleading claims about their environmental credentials or their environmental performance. So, you know, whether it's oil companies justifying new drilling in the Indian Ocean by planting thousands of trees in South America, or clothing companies making dubious claims about the sustainability of the fabrics that they use, or, you know, endless businesses of all kinds making you feel better about your purchasing by planting a tree, or businesses just seeding confusion, seeding a bit of uncertainty with claims like, you know, using terms like natural. What does natural mean? Biodegradable. What on earth does biodegradable mean? Recyclable. All these fairly vague terms that, when you dig a bit deeper, often don't mean a great deal. And this is, I would argue, a significant commercial risk now. And it's a risk that will increase in the years ahead as more and more scrutiny is applied to businesses that are making claims about their environmental performance. So what I want to talk about here is how you can avoid that risk and how you can develop an approach to managing your environmental impacts that has real integrity. And the first point I would make is the importance of being comprehensive, of scoping all of your environmental impacts as a business. Some of your impacts are obvious. You'll be well aware of them. You know, the gas and the electricity that you use to run your business, the waste that your business generates, you know, obvious impacts on the environment from those things. But some perhaps more indirect environmental impacts that are easily overlooked. So, and I've listed some examples on the screen there. Gemma talked about the importance of scope 3. A lot of this stuff would come under your scope 3 carbon emissions if we're talking about carbon footprinting. So the impacts of the supply chains of the goods and services that you use, the emissions from those will probably make up a very significant proportion of your overall carbon footprint as a business. Some of the financial services that you use could have very significant indirect environmental impacts. So the banking, the insurance, the workplace pension scheme investments, all of those things indirectly as a result of your business are impacting on the environment. the travel of your guests, your customers, depending what type of business that you are, not an easy thing for you to address, for you to manage, but that will have significant environmental impacts. We saw the significance of it overall in terms of Cumbria, and it will be similarly significant in your business by all accounts. So lots of indirect negative impacts that it's easy to overlook, but also there are positive impacts that we sometimes overlook when we're thinking about the environmental impacts of a business. And it's important, I think, when you're approaching this whole area, that you consider as a business how you can maximize your potential positive environmental impacts. I remember I did some work for the Langdale Hotel a couple of years ago, and we spent a lot of time as part of that work thinking about how the experience of staying in that hotel could be used as a tool for enhancing the environmental awareness of the people who stayed there, of connecting visitors more closely with nature, with the environment around them. So it's important to acknowledge the many and the varied negative environmental impacts of your business, but also to think about the potential positive role that you can play in influencing others, whether that's guests or staff or other businesses in your networks, perhaps. So point number one, be comprehensive in thinking through your environmental impacts. Secondly, focus on the important impacts of your business. Some of your biggest impacts may be very difficult or impossible for you to do a great deal about, or at least do a great deal about in the short term, either because addressing them is very expensive. Replacing your gas boilers, for example, not an easy or cheap thing to do, or because you have limited control, limited choice. There may be aspects of goods and services that you buy that you don't have a great deal of choice over, or you feel like you don't have a great deal of choice over. But that should never be an excuse for ignoring these things. It's important in your policies, in the way that you present your approach to this whole area, to the wider world, that you are upfront about all of your significant environmental impacts, and you're honest about what you're able to do and about your limitations. So be upfront about all of the impacts that you have. And then in terms of what you do, the easy wins can be good for motivation, for getting a bit of momentum in your management of your environmental impacts. But the big impacts are the ones that you should be prioritizing. Ellie is going to say a little bit in the second presentation this morning about carbon footprinting. So I'll just briefly mention it here, but carbon footprinting can be a really useful tool for zeroing in on what those significant impacts are. It can really help that prioritization process, of understanding where the big impacts of your business lie. I've given an example there on the screen of waste. If you were to review business environmental policies, if we were to download a few from the web and review them, I would wager that waste and recycling would feature very prominently in most of them. And it's understandable because waste is very visible to you as a business. It's very visible to your customers as well, to your staff. And there are very good reasons to improve waste management in a business. Don't get me wrong. It's not something that you should ignore, but it's very rarely in a business a significant source of carbon emissions. There are usually a host of other things that deserve a higher priority than waste management. So focus on the important stuff in dealing with your environmental impacts, and think about maybe using carbon footprinting as a tool for understanding what that important stuff is. And then number 3, how can you deliver? How can you move from having a policy, a great policy, to actually delivering action? Because increasingly that's what's going to be looked for by consumers, by your customers. And three very quick points on that. A strong policy, it's really important to have a strong policy, to make your intentions clear, to set the tone across the business of what you're going to do. But on its own, it won't be sufficient to drive change. You need more than a policy to drive change within your business. So second point, you need a structured action plan with a clear set of actions that will deliver your policy objectives, the objectives stated within your policy. And I'll give you an example on the next slide of what I mean by a structured action plan. But then before I do that, thirdly, and Gemma's touched on this already, if you have staff in your business, then your policy will only be effective. You'll only be able to deliver your policy if your staff are on board, if they're aligned with that policy, if they understand the issues and they're equipped to deliver the actions that you've identified. This is partly just about communication. It's partly about a clear assignment of responsibilities, but training and awareness raising can also be really important, really helpful in getting staff on board and getting traction with your approach across the business. And I've got some more on training, currently available training in my final slide. But just to jump back to having a structured action plan. This is our Green Small Business Action Planning portal, just a screenshot from a pretend action plan in our action planning portal, just to give you a sense of what I mean. So we've got all of the activities of the business, these black boxes. So running an office, lighting, heating, powering premises. Under each of these activities, we've got drop-down boxes showing us what the impacts of those activities are. So in this case, emissions from the energy use for heating. And then below that, to address those impacts, we've got our actions. So we've got, and then for each action, we've got advice that we provide to clients. But crucially, we're setting priorities. We're giving timescales to these actions, and we're assigning responsibility so that everybody knows what they've got to do to deliver the action plan. So, a structured approach like this, where you're clearly laying out all of the actions that you're going to take to address your environmental impacts, you're identifying the priorities, you're setting timescales for delivery. Obviously, you have to flex with those a lot of the time, and that's fine. But you're assigning responsibility. Having a real clear structure like that is crucial to driving change. And so in our portal, we have a dashboard for all our clients, so they can see how they're progressing, and then you can record their carbon footprint data in it as well. There are other alternatives to green small business. Obviously, I'm slightly biased, clearly, but there are lots of alternatives, alternative approaches to getting a structured approach to environmental management in place within your business. And I guess a preferred approach for many businesses, and this is something that many of you will know far more about than I do, but the green tourism scheme obviously is specific to your sector, so may well be a preferred approach for many of you. I don't know a huge amount about this scheme, but looking at the website, it does refer to the fact that they help you, they have a structured approach to assessing your current performance and put in place bespoke reports or action plans to move you forward. So this might be an alternative scheme that you could pursue to get this kind of structured approach in place. And there are all sorts of other schemes out there as well, which you can find with a very brief bit of Googling. So just finally, before I stop for questions, some of the support and the funding that's currently available. If you're in the South Lakes area, South Lakeland District Council have a subsidy scheme at the moment, so you can get 50% subsidy towards achieving Green Small Business certification. So you can get Green Small Business certification from as little as £150 currently, with help from South Lakeland District Council. And there's the email address there if you want to find out more about that. If you're in the Barrow area, don't know if anyone on the call is in the Barrow area, but they have Barrow Borough Council have a low carbon business support program running at the moment, quite a comprehensive support program for local businesses. And you can email me directly if you want to find out more about that. If you're in the Eden area, they have a Greening Eden business program. I'm not involved in that, but there are lots of details about it on the Eden District Council website. And then in terms of training, I'm currently involved in delivering 2 training courses at Lancaster and Morecambe College. So these are accredited, nationally accredited training courses for business owners and managers, a level 2 course for business owners and managers, and a level 1 course aimed at kind of raising awareness amongst employees. And the website, it's rather complicated, but it's up on the screen there, and we can put that that URL into the chat as well so that you can access it more easily. But the Lancaster and Morecambe College website and their part-time training courses. So do have a look at that and make the most of it, because it's currently available free of charge. Thanks, Gemma.
Right, I think if we do a short question and answer session, so if you've got any burning questions for Tim, I think we've had one in the chat from Anne. Well, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer this one here or not. Is there funding available for battery storage, electricity? I don't know whether Ellie might be able to answer that one.
Actually, when we were speaking, I was trying to find out some information specific to Cumbria. What I would say is that, and Gemma's asked me because we're involved in battery storage ourselves, there's not anything that I know of specifically. However, we are, and I hate this phrase, but we are on this journey. And what I would do is keep a keen eye open. And if we hear anything, we can certainly pass that to Gemma. But I've also passed it on to a colleague who's doing some research as we speak, specifically for the Cumbria area. There has been a funding historically, but I know that's closed now. But my reference point would also be CAFS, the Cumbria Action for Sustainability. That would be an initial point where I would want to go and have a look. And I can certainly update Gemma if, or I'll update you in the presentation if I find anything out in the presentation. But if not, I'll certainly let Cumbria Tourism know, and we can email everybody with that information.
Yeah, I would have said CAS would be a starting point, although I'm not sure they've got anything specific for that at the moment. I know the Lake District Foundation grants, which I'm not sure, they're about to open for another round potentially, but I'm not sure if that's already kind of pre-allocated from previous applications that they've had. But I suspect that would have been something that you could have potentially put in for as part of a package through that ESIF funding. But again, that would be 60% funded. So it's kind of funding support, match funding, so you'd have to find the other 40% yourself. But that probably would have qualified as long as you could have shown statistics on sort of the carbon savings from that, which I'm pretty sure would be out there somewhere.
Yeah. Where would I go for that application?
It's Lake District National Park and surrounding areas, but if you look on the Lake District Foundation website, it should be promoted under there, but I'll just I'll pop a link in the chat for you now if that helps, Anne.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions? Right, stunned silence. Well, I think we're going to move on and just have some little breakout groups now, just to make the session a little bit more interactive. So the purpose of these breakout groups is just to give you, it's just an opportunity to have a little bit of a think about where your business in particular might have a big positive or negative impact, and also what are the barriers, what sort of things you could do and implement to try and overcome those and try and either, you know, improve those positive impacts, negate those negative impacts, but then also a little bit of thinking about what the barriers are to that, and also how to monitor that as well. So I think Ben is just going to split us all off into 2 different groups now. So you should be allocated shortly into a room, and I'll be leading one session and Ellie will be leading the other. So that will be about 10 minutes. Then we'll come back and myself and Ellie will just give a quick overview of some of the interesting discussions, and then we'll move on to Ellie's presentation. Right, I think that's everybody back out of the breakout rooms. I hope everybody found those sessions useful. There's some quite interesting conversations going on in ours. I think a lot of people are already very much aware of where their impacts are, and they're already doing quite a lot of work to try and mitigate those. But there's quite a few people doing some very positive impacts as well. Discussions around potential rewilding projects and things like that on site, which is quite exciting. So we probably talked a little bit more about how we communicate those messages and how we get those out there. And actually, you know, if we are aware of what we're doing, it is just an exercise. Then, you know, if we're already on that journey and it already is a sort of an approach that is embedded within the business, it's how that's just formalised and translated into that environmental policy so that people are much more aware of it. And it's then possibly just even making check-in points within that and putting notes in diaries just to remember every 6 months or a year, just to refresh it and review it and actually update it, change your target slightly. If you've already achieved something, shout that you've achieved it, but then, you know, actually look at where you can go next. So it is that kind of continual process, I think. But yeah, some really interesting discussions. Ellie, have you got some feedback?
Yeah, I'll try and summarise. It sounds like it's been a similar style of conversation. Ours has been, if I pick up a couple of the key points, we've spoken a lot about the region specifically, but actually really interesting being data-led to make informed decisions. And actually John was sharing that he has actually written a paper for his MBA, and it's based on transport, and it's going to be so useful for his business. It's so insightful. But actually we spoke a lot about actually the data that he had found, and that really is making allowing him to make really informed decisions and then looking at the options from that. We spoke about CAFs quite a lot, actually, about, you know, tools and places to go and having a signpost. And I think throughout the whole conversation, wider than this, there's a few questions of where to go and what to do, and I think that's exactly what this is about. But we've been very rushed, and we could probably have had the whole hour talking about lots of various different bits, but we touched on technology, collaboration, and making small impacts, but also using, like you said, the messaging. Actually, there's an awareness of actually, oh my goodness, I am doing some really amazing things. things. How can I market that and message that to get the right customers in so they can all come on board, and then we can share that journey together and we can have a louder voice. So if one person shouts, it's difficult for everyone to hear, but if lots of people start to shout about some of these, so we were sort of talking about integrity within the business, leading back to what Tim had said as well about standing, you know, strong and knowing what your values are, and, you know, working with that. And there was conversations about working with third parties to try and enable that. And there's a shift in the market where you're really able to highlight those things as well. But there was lots of conversation. I hope that's just a top line summary.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to screen share now, Ellie. I think Ellie's just going to do a little bit of a follow-up in terms of sort of carbon accounting and just that extra step of how you actually monitor and track what you're doing, and obviously that then kind of feedback loop in terms of the evaluation.
Yeah, sure. Can everybody see my screen? I think everyone can see my screen. Okay, well, it's really nice. I've met probably half the people in the group, and half I haven't met at the moment. So yes, nice to meet you. My name is Ellie Marshall. I work for a group of companies called the Eco Group, and specifically I'm here more from Eco Go Zero today, although I do work across all the businesses. We're a carbon mitigation business that have got a really large range of solutions for businesses and industries to help mitigate carbon. So a little bit of background. Obviously, I'm going to be speaking about carbon accounting, but I do think there's a little bit of a background of why we're here and why it's happening, and just some background details, really. In 2019, the UK government was one of the first to say that it will be net zero by 2050. And I know a lot of people in this room are aware of what net zero is, but it's when the amount of greenhouse gas emissions are produced by a business is equaled by the amount of emissions that they remove. A few other things to mention is emissions are the things that we produce in the daily business activities, so examples of fumes from factories, vehicles, as well as the heat products that they produce. There are also emissions from the services that we sell and the products that we make. So I know I've spoken to a few people who've had hostels, but I'm not sure who else is in the room and if there's anybody who physically makes things. So all of these basically, as we know, contribute to damaging the climate and the environment. And the best way to get net zero is just not to produce these emissions in the first place, but that's not always possible, and we don't live in this utopia. But reduction is something that we have to try, and we've got to cut down on the waste and the energy that we use as much as possible. So really, to be net zero, as an average, on average, a business would need to mitigate about 90% of its baseline emissions. Now, the reason I'm giving all these background is because businesses are increasingly seeing pressure to move beyond ambitions and aspirations, and we need to move to an action-based system now. We physically need to start putting these in place when it comes to having a net zero future. So businesses who don't commit to net zero are going to be negatively impacted, and we're going to cover that as we go along a little bit more. So what is driving companies to net zero targets? Well, mandatory reporting. We've got government policy that is coming into place. We've mentioned a lot here about customer attitudes. I also think staff attitudes. I think a big part of this is about recruitment, retention, and attracting the right staff. Our Eco Group are actually sending a message out to, our MD, is sending a message out to the whole of the group explaining why we're doing what we're doing, and to try and get the right attitudes aligned for understanding why there'll be changes within some of the wider businesses, and to try and get them to take that home and take that conscientious thought. So we've started that journey of trying to get our staff on board with that. Cost reduction, obviously, you know, everything comes down to cost, and businesses do have challenges when it comes to costs, with everything that we've gone through, with the what we're going through with all the energy crisis, we've been through COVID, and now we're trying to make all these challenges where some of the interventions that we're having will have a cost impact. There will also be, there's things that I haven't put on here, but there'll also we've already started to see that if you tender at any point, this is now a tender requirement. It is now a requirement starting to come in for business contracts. And what we will start to see is, and it was mentioned earlier on about banks for investment and financial due diligence. I did actually mention in previously, I actually have a stat to share that actually there is a Cumbrian issue, and I'll just give one example, but we have challenges for electric charge points. Cumbria only has 5.5 rapid charge points per 100 kilometres of road, and only 4.8 chargers per every 1,000 households. So, but if we compare Cumbria to the rest of the UK as a whole has 9.2 rapid chargers per 100 kilometres. So as a county, we also have challenges to do that, and rural areas. So I think for us, there's some of the challenges that we're going to face. Why are we having carbon accounting? Why is this come into force? What's pushing it? What's driving it? Well, if you haven't heard already, it's the Paris Agreement, which is an international pact, makes it part of the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. You'll often see that as UNFCCC. We signed it in 2016, and countries that agreed that they needed to limit the global temperature rises and try and reduce that down. What we did is it was compared to before the Industrial Revolution, and so what we need to try and do is the 1.5 degrees, but really we need to be aiming for 2 really, but they've agreed to the 1.5. And the nations that signed the Paris Agreement also agreed to make their finances investments work towards lowering greenhouse gas emissions and protecting people and economies against climate change. And all the countries that were involved had to set their own targets to work towards this goal, and then they have to regularly report on their progress. So just as a summary, 194 states and the EU signed the agreement, and out of that, 188 states and the EU were ratified. So those who were ratified, just to give a percentage, represent more than 97% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, which is huge. I won't spend too long on this about what scope 1, 2 and 3 are. I think it's something that we've already covered a little bit earlier on. I have tried to cover this in a little bit more detail for those who are quite early on in the journey. But I do have a couple of stats to share with you again. So when we're talking about electric and we're talking about gas, I was in a local meeting where these stats were shared, that there's 0.193 kilograms of carbon per kilowatt of electric that is produced, and for gas it's 0.183 kilograms of carbon per kilowatt. So when we're looking at our fuel consumptions, when we're looking at our scope 1 and 2s, and we're trying to find out the carbon, you know, all of these things are really, really important to help us create a plan and to create a measure. And generally, when we're looking at this, and I'm going to lean back to what was mentioned earlier on, for scope 1, that tends to be about 10% of somebody's business. Scope 2, again, it's about 10%, and scope 3 tends to be about 80% of the carbon in total. We've mentioned that scope 1 and 2 are things that you can start now, and scope 3 is something that you will you know, this is where, when we were discussing about influence, this is where trying to influence your supply chain, the customers that you have, this is where scope 3 is really, really important, because it makes up the biggest part of emissions, and it's the hardest section to tackle. However, I do have some dates and some stats to share with you about when all this is coming in. But I suppose what I would be saying at this point for scope 1, 2 and 3 are a couple of questions to ask yourself as a business. So really, when you're looking at your scope 1, 2 and 3, is the questions I'd be asking is, what's the total amount of carbon emitted from your business? what part of the business or value chain is responsible for the emissions, and where do carbon reduction opportunities exist within your business. And by doing this analytics and doing this process, they're the three elements that you'll be able to start monitoring and going through and working out where those points of being able to reduce those emissions are, who's responsible for the emissions, and how can those be mitigated. So it's all part of sort of the longer journey. So how is a footprint defined? There's a couple of things, and I know there's a variety of businesses here, so I've tried to cover a large range of sectors here. But for an ongoing organisation, the carbon footprint is defined as the last 12 months of a carbon emission. For reporting, most organisations will set a specific 12-month period, which is usually aligned with their financial reporting year. And what I would say about this is, when people start to get into the thought of carbon accounting, is very much about, think of this as if you think about your financial reporting. So you will do your accounts every month, you will start to analyse it, you'll see what's in the bank, what you can spend. And again, the same sort of mindset and thought needs to be had for this as well. So although that you'll set a specific 12-month period, actually what we would say is, monitor it on a month-by-month basis, because this really allows you then to keep this at the very front of your mind. It allows you to see where things are making the impact or not making the impact. You can see the actions, so if you've made small changes, you can start to see what might be working really quickly. But also you can provide a more regular process when reporting to managers, stakeholders, or your own staff. So it is possible to report carbon accounts for a specific project or an event, and I'm aware that there's a variety of people within that Cumbria reaches. So for example, I'm aware that there's a lot of event companies out there, or I'm aware that maybe there would be a specific project that you might be working on, and I think it's just interesting to know that this is slightly different. So if it's less than a year in duration, you can actually account for a specific project. However, or if it's a one-time only event, you can also do carbon accounting for that specific event. But if an organisation's normal business is a series of shorter projects or events, and a good example of that is a construction company, then that does need to be included in the overall accounts of the organisation. So carbon accounting, in essence, is key to tackling the impacts of climate change, providing data and an insight to exactly where emissions are being produced and where they are absorbed. And really what we want to do is we want to steer away from choices that have less a potential impact on achieving carbon reduction goals. So what can carbon accounts look like? This is a system, we actually have a carbon accountancy system, what we do, and I've just given some examples over on the side what this can look for. But carbon accountancy is important for a few reasons. It now is no longer just a nice thing to have. It is increasingly an industry standard requirement for many businesses, such as the ISO 14060, for example, the British Standards Institute, the PAS 2060. We've heard it mentioned earlier on in the breakout room that we're finding that third parties are wanting this information, such as booking systems, tendering are asking for this now, business contracts are asking for this now. So it is something that we are seeing coming through more and more. So the reason we've chose this system, and the reason I talk about it in this way, is that the reason we did a lot of research, and for us, when you're starting to look at your carbon accounts and you're looking at what system to use, there are a few things that I really, really would just like to send home and for you to memorize and really take to the forefront, really. And one of those things is how these carbon accountancy systems will be holding your data. We've done a lot of research, and some of the businesses, they're very much into greenwashing. They're very much into not wanting to go into how they're going to be storing your data, what they're going to be using it for. And so one of my asks is that when you're doing your research for carbon accounting, that you do ask and have a look into the data. For us on this system, you control your data, and that's why we chose this system, and it isn't held by somebody else, and we're not tied. One of the people that we spoke to, we would be tied for over 100 years with them on that system for the data, and look really how your data is being stored. Another thing to mention is have a look at the finer details. So for example, on this system, we don't pay to offset this system. We look at how to mitigate. And this is actually directly lined with the UN. So every time that the UN changes their rules and regulations, this automatically updates. So as small business owners, you have many, many hats that you have to hold. However, I would be looking at a system that makes your life easy and changes and informs you as you go along. A bit like your accounts, you're going to need lots of advice. And again, that's why we chose this system, because actually what this enabled us to do is have the support as we go along. But what I would say is when you set carbon accounts can sound really, really daunting. And this really mimics a message we were saying earlier on. But actually, once you start the process and once you start to do it on a regular basis and start to learn how to do the system, actually it's a very, very easy system to start to maintain. And for example, on this system, you can see lots of graphs and you can see lots of icons. Actually, on this system, it's enabled that you can start to use this for tendering processes, or you can use it for reporting, and you can download all the infographics that are on here to be able to utilize for other resources as well. So if you hear data and offsetting, please check and double check and make sure that you're aligning yourself. I really do feel this will be the next PPI scandal style system, and so I'm hoping that I can share some of that so the right questions can be asked and the right research can be done. We actually found out another statistic the other day that 97% of the world's carbon credits are actually set up to facilitate offsetting, not mitigation, which is quite a scary statistic. I said I would share some timelines for you. By legislation, small and medium businesses are not required to report yet. However, the SECR, which is the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, encourages all businesses to start as soon as possible. So those that sit in a supply chain of larger businesses are going to be under increasing pressure to act now. It's expected that the SECR thresholds will reduce over time to include all SMEs. If I'm going to put a time frame, we expect to see that over the next 3 to 5 years. However, if you can start your journey now and you can start to reduce all those factors down, we can start to eventually look at cost saving. We can start to look at being able to tender. It's not going to be a supply chain issue. And if there are any businesses out there who are part of a supply chain, you know, I think you are going to need to do this earlier than the 3 to 5 years. If you do align yourself with other booking systems or other organisations, the pressure probably will come from them downwards. So yes, across the board, carbon accounts is something that you need to take seriously. It is best to start now, and it is best to, you know, just begin that journey. Now, we've talked about scope 1 and 2, and probably where we would say is, I would just say, you know, as a summary of everything, start to understand, if you want a place to start to just understand your current scope 1 and 2 emissions. It's a really good place to start, and then start to look at what tangible plans you can have to reduce or eliminate scope 1 or 2 emissions. That's the perfect place to start. Then I would say once you've mastered all of that, then you can start to look at scope 3. But because scope 3 is, you know, there's so many more impacts of other businesses. For me right here, right now, I think the most important thing is to start with your scope 1 and 2 and see what you can do to help improve that, then move on to scope 3. So I just have a couple of key things to consider, and hopefully end on a positive note. So net zero, it is a journey. Break it down into priorities and the most relevant steps for your business. You're not going to make one big jump and have it all done. This is going to be something like your accounts that you just need to chip out, get organised and start to do on a monthly basis. Net zero is a collaboration, and it does require all of your stakeholders to work together to achieve it. And so it's already been mentioned several times today about collaboration, but actually it's a collaboration as a county, it's a collaboration of people, of businesses, of your customers, you know, everybody. We all need to work together to try and make this movement. Now, as a technology company who does carbon mitigation, you know, I know that they can provide a lot of the solutions. However, it won't solve everything. It will only solve 2/3 of the problem. So, you know, there are all sorts of services coming. There is all sorts of battery technology coming. There's all sorts of decarbonisation solutions. We've heard of hydrogen. All of this will come, and there will be solutions along the way. However, technology can't solve how much you consume and what you waste, and they're things that you can impact. And my other thing to mention is it is a learning curve, and the sooner you start, the sooner you'll start to get your head around all the various different things you need to achieve, just like you did when maybe you first started your business. And just remember, it is really, really similar to your annual accounts. So I'm just going to end on a positive, that good businesses change for better business. And just to, you know, make the first step is a really, really good place to start. So I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully come back on the screen if you can see me. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions. The only thing I will say is this is just a starting point for everybody, and this is just to get you thinking of where to go. As Gemma mentioned earlier on, we do lots of training courses, we do lots of advice. But if there's anything generally that I can answer, I probably won't get into anyone's business specifics, and I'm happy for anybody to contact me afterwards. I'm happy for anyone to fire over any questions.
Do we have any questions? We will circulate the speakers' contact details after the event as well to everybody, and we do have some sort of very basic rough guidance templates in terms of a sustainability policy and an action plan. So it just takes you through a very simple process. But Tim also has some great resources online as well on his website, and the Green Small Business as an organisation can kind of help take you through that process, or they can, you know, if you go through that process yourself, are then quite happy to support if you do want to sign up to one of our certification schemes as well. Again, because kind of going through this process and producing your environmental policy actually kind of sets you up very well to then apply for some of the certification schemes. So I think Ellie has very ably managed to get us back on track in terms of time. Again, if anybody wants to ask questions after the event, feel free, and we will circulate all the speakers' details and everything. But I don't think nobody's got any hands up or anything. So there are, just to mention, I'll send some details out as well with the follow-up, but Cumbria Tourism do have an online toolkit, a sustainability toolkit, which was funded by ESIF as part of the Low Carbon Lake District programme. I have put a link in the chat to that, but it might be worth just having a look. There are quite a few different resources on there, including under the influencing visitor behaviour section, some funding sources for EV charge points, which is something that came up in our discussion. There's also a funding section on there which highlights some of the funding that was mentioned by Tim as well. I think his training is in there through Morecambe College, but I'll just double check that it is actually in there. Again, that is kind of an ever-moving one, and one that does get continually updated, that toolkit, so it's always worth periodically checking back in. But yeah, it's hopefully a useful resource for people as well. So if there's no further questions, I shall let you all get on with your day and hopefully digest some of this information. Thank you all very much for attending.